Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adamson. This is DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We have a really interesting show here today. Two big guests. It's Jake Fromm a little bit later on. It's Mike Griffith coming up there, too. I'm also going to do something. This idea kind of popped into my head the other day of, perhaps we should do something that's like semi-informative for a change as opposed to me just sort of shouting out, crackpot opinions. So we have a major new horizon that's like right there, in our field of vision for the upcoming season. New playoff format, all of this completely different. So we're going to talk today just on kind of an informational basis about those of you who aren't exactly sure about all of this. Here is what it's going to be. And we'll also use that sort of space to imagine a little bit about what that might look like. In fact, one of our brethren in the media has done just that. So we'll talk about how all of the new college football playoff kind of relates to Georgia. And speaking of Georgia here for a moment, there is also some concern out there. Paul Finebaum saying, expectations, if you're Georgia, be careful they don't get too high. Maybe no surprise here, but I think you'll like Kirby Smart's perspective on this same topic more than what Finebaum had to say. In fact, we'll kick that off with that as our opening topic on today's show. So we're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
If you sit real still for a moment, you may hear it, the sound of sirens going off, warnings off in the distance. Apparently that's what Paul Finebaum thinks. Now, this isn't that big of a deal necessarily, but I do think it sets us up for an interesting conversation. Finebaum made an appearance. He does a radio deal each and every week. We talked the other day about the Mac and Cube show. That's Greg McElroy, Cole Kubelik, their radio program. Finebaum appears with them each and every week, and Finebaum had just spent some time with Kirby Smart. You've heard some of that already, and was just sort of talking about, the situation around Georgia, expected to be preseason number one, coming off a couple of national championships. And so the question comes up of, well, what could slow Georgia down? What could prevent Georgia from achieving everything in the future years that it seems like they could achieve, and perhaps this year as well? And so Finebaum, in discussing this, talked about what he sees, like a lot of programs that have perhaps been in the same spot that Georgia's been before, mounting expectations. And as Finebaum describes, and this is where the hyperbole kind of comes in, and the warnings and the scariness and the music change, Finebaum sort of suggests, hey, if you're not careful, these expectations get out of control. And I don't know what happens at that point, but apparently something bad happens, at least according to the telling from Paul Finebaum, on with Greg McElroy and Cole Kubelik. This is what Finebaum said that he sees as a potential concern when it comes to out of control expectations at Georgia.
The expectations are just simply out of control. Let's say they don't win this year, and maybe next year things go haywire, and the quarterback gets hurt or somebody leaves, and they have a very pedestrian 9-3 season. Then fans start to really get edgy, and then what happens then? Let me repeat what we've all watched here over the last 17 years is that then the coach goes like, what else do I have to do? I've won 2 national championships. I've won this. I've won that. I was talking to some Clemson people over the weekend at an event, and they're struggling right now. I mean, they played, for 4 national championships in a finite period of time. They were in the playoffs one other time or maybe 2 other times, and they feel like the world has come undone. Now, realizing that their coach is a little different than Kirby Smart, and he did not adapt well at where Kirby did. But it doesn't take much, especially when you've won so successfully.
So there are a few things about what Paul Finebaum says there on WJOX that I want to discuss here for a moment. Look around Georgia here right now with fans and, obviously in the aftermath of having won 2 national championships. I'm asking you this legitimately. Do you see expectations as being out of control? Do you see, anything that sort of seems hysterical? I would say no. I think that expectations are what they have always been. And this is where I think the average college football fan gets a bad rap. And in my mind, this goes beyond just what you'd say about Georgia fans, but any of these so-called like rabid sports fans that people always kind of make fun of them a little bit. Like, do you know like the social media account? It's called Message Board Geniuses. It's one of those. I'm not against message board geniuses necessarily, but there's this sort of subculture of college football media that kind of makes fun of the out-of-control fan. In fact, that's a little bit what the Finebaum show is. It's a little bit of a platform in kind of a deadpan way of we'll put the crazy fan out there and we'll all, sophisticated, erudite people have a laugh at unsophisticated fans. That's a little bit about there's a certain subculture in college football media that sort of functions that way. But when you look around, do you see hysterical, irrational fan behavior on a regular basis? I kind of don't. I think what Georgia fans recognize is, and this, by the way, is backed up by all kinds of evidence, that for a long time, Georgia had the resources to win. They had the resource to win championships, and it's not anybody's fault. The truth is the previous coach, Mark Richt, came very close to doing that, and for a multitude of reasons, it just didn't quite happen. Or before that, there were also opportunities there as well. It's not anybody's fault. It's no one, necessarily you don't point the finger of blame at anyone, but Georgia had all the resources to win, but for whatever reason, it just wasn't. Georgia was always ranking like number one or very near the top on the best jobs in college football for the people who do that kind of thing. Or when you think about talent in state, our home state of Georgia is always ranked very high on things like that. So for Georgia fans who were like, man, this team needs to be winning national championships, there was a lot of evidence to support that's probably true. And so now Georgia is winning national championships. It's won a couple. We believe it'll win perhaps a few more. But, the fact that the expectations are now being met doesn't mean that expectations get any crazier or now the expectations go to an even higher place, because the truth is there's no higher place for expectations to go. At a place like Georgia, anything less than a national championship is not quite good enough. Now, that doesn't mean that anybody's going to be perfect, because from year to year, game to game, obviously perfection isn't really attainable. But excellence on a regular basis, when you have a resource advantage like Georgia has, it's only just natural that you would assume that's the kind of thing that Georgia could marshal to its benefit there. And, to Finebaum's point of, well, what happens if Georgia goes 9-3? I don't mind answering that question. If Georgia were to go 9-3 this year, next year, or kind of any year for the foreseeable future, that would be an unimaginable calamity. I can promise you. That would be an awful, disastrous thing. Now, could it happen if you had a whole series of injuries, things like that? I guess maybe so. But the whole point of Georgia building itself up to the level that it's been built up, are you familiar with the concept of being like anti-fragile? Georgia sort of built up to be anti-fragile. This idea that it's not easily broken, it's not easily knocked off course. Not only does it withstand some pressure, but when the pressure mounts, as a program, Georgia has the potential and the tendency to get better, because it's not just resistant to being fragile, it's anti-fragile. It actually thrives in those type of situations. So no, for the foreseeable future, I don't see Georgia going 9-3. And if it does, I can promise you it'll be a 5-alarm fire here in this program and in any place where Georgia fans get together. And that's just a fact. That's just, kind of how all that goes. And as far as the whole thing of, well, look at Clemson. As Finebaum himself is correct to point out here, yeah, there's a massive difference between Clemson and Georgia. And, Clemson is not what it once was. They were most recently in the playoff in 2020. When Georgia and Clemson played to open the 2021 season, Clemson as a program was still good enough to be favored over Georgia. When these two teams play at noon on August the 31st, or whatever the date is of the first game of the season, Georgia's expected to be about a 2-touchdown favorite there in that spot. It gives you an idea of how much the fortunes of those programs have reversed themselves over the course of the last few years. And it's not because, well, the expectations just caught up to Clemson. No, it's that Clemson isn't what it was. Trust me, if Clemson was still as good now as it was in 2018, 2019, and even in 2020, the pandemic year, I have a little bit of a feeling here that Clemson fans would probably still be pretty happy about all that kind of stuff. But what they see is, as Finebaum points out, Dabo Swinney's not very aggressive right now in pursuing talent in the transfer portal for sure, but frankly, even when it comes to high school football recruiting there as well. And you sort of realize, well, some of this stuff has sort of always been going on for Clemson, but perhaps we didn't notice it when they had Trevor Lawrence at quarterback or they had Deshaun Watson at quarterback. those type of, kind of roster management blemishes were just a little bit easier to ignore. They're not quite so easy to ignore anymore. So some of the disappointment you hear from Clemson fans, I would say, is just thoughtful consideration of a program in decline here. And it's Dabo Swinney's job to do something about that. It's not Clemson fans' job to ignore it. It's Dabo's job to fix it. So in this particular case, for maybe a rare instance, we're sort of on the side of Clemson fans when it comes to all of that. But all of this sort of builds to this point. Now, when it comes to the very high expectations that Georgia fans and other fan bases like this have for their program, you may not be surprised to find out that Kirby Smart's response and understanding of all of this is perhaps a little bit better than Paul Finebaum's is. Because when Smart was on with Paul Finebaum, an interview that aired on Monday that was recorded last week, when it comes to the subject of expectations and all that kind of stuff, it certainly sounds like for this year and perhaps any year to come, Georgia's more than happy to embrace them and take them face first and head on. This is what Kirby Smart told Paul Finebaum about that topic.
We've come to have an expectation of excellence, and there's a standard now of like, hey, you're supposed to win every game. And I watched that happen, at Alabama, where it was like, if you're not careful, you find no joy in winning.
Right.
And if you take the joy and suck the joy out of winning, it makes your career shorter, it makes it frustrating for the players. So we still celebrate every win, because on the SEC, playing on the road is really hard. So when we win games, we get excited about it. We find joy in it, and we've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed that ride. I think it's different every year. Now, if you have a different team, I'm trying to figure out exactly what this team needs. This team has been a little hungrier in spring ball because they didn't win it. They weren't in the playoffs. So there's a little bit of more motivation there.
I love that clip from Kirby Smart. Two things about it in particular. Thing number one is this. Now, I do think that Georgia fans, if I'm being completely honest here, and I, of course, am in the group with Georgia fans, but I do think in this particular case, my observation of other Georgia fans is that when Kirby Smart says, as a team, we try to celebrate, we try to have joy and appreciate winning as it takes place. He mentioned celebrating road wins, things like that. And, you'll see Kirby put the visor on backwards. He'll start dancing, just having fun. I do believe that Georgia fans could take a little bit of a page from Kirby and celebrate the individual games and the moments to moment a little more than they do. One of the things, as someone who hosts the DawgNation postgame show and sees the immediate reaction that fans have right after a game, just to be completely honest, I think that sometimes there's a little too much nitpicking and things like that. I think the overall fan expectations for Georgia are probably well-founded, but how you act in relationship to that moment to moment, I think Kirby and the team probably get that a little bit more right than sometimes fans do. When Georgia wins a rivalry game, like, say, beating Auburn the last few years or beating Florida the last few years, because those teams are not particularly good, there are some fans who think the games now matter less. But if you watch the way the team celebrates, they understand, hey, even beating a perceived bad team is still a hard thing to do when it comes to the SEC, so therefore we're going to celebrate it. And I do think the average fan could take a little bit more of a page from Kirby and Georgia on that. The sort of week-to-week joy and the week-to-week happiness, I think making sure as a fan you seek that out and find that for yourself, I think that's probably a pretty wise thing to do. But more importantly than that, what about the statement that Kirby Smart makes at the end there? And this is where I think your ears ought to perk up, and I'm sure yours probably did. There's all this chatter about expectations are sky high. They're through the roof. Perhaps it's even, out of control, too much in the way of expectations this year and every year for Georgia maybe. What Kirby Smart says is, listen, people can say what they want to on the outside. What I'm noticing about my own team, Kirby Smart might say, is I'm seeing a team right now that's even hungrier than last year's team was, because this team doesn't have the taste of having just won the national championship. They want that back. Now, listen, how good does that sound to the ears of a Georgia fan right now? That a Georgia team as talented on paper as this one appears to be is also, according to Kirby's telling of this, pretty hungry right now too, because they didn't get that championship here last year. To me, that sounds like a very good thing for a Georgia fan to hear, and perhaps very bad news for the rest of college football. Not only is Georgia on paper best team in America, almost certainly going to be the preseason number one team, they are also hungry to get back that national championship. They did not have it in 2023, but it sounds like they have sights set on getting that in 2024, and that is why the expectations are so high. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are presented today by Breda Pest Management, and we are happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us across all platforms, video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, all kinds of platforms. The world-famous DawgNation.com, radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref podcast, wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, everything else in between. Just really happy to have you as a part of our program today. And a big thanks to our friends at Breda Pest Management who make it all possible. Obviously, our folks at Breda Pest Management understand big expectations because they've been living up to people's expectations for them for quite some time. They're all about that. In fact, they've been recognized as the official pest control provider of UGA athletics. That is what they are all about. So if you're going to be at Foley Field here this week for the big baseball series for Georgia against Florida, as Georgia continues to make a case for itself with some really advantageous seeding moving towards the NCAA tournament, well, as you're looking around there at Foley Field, just keep in mind, termite-free, bug-free, critter-free, the company in charge of making sure that remains true, our friends at Breda Pest Management. Same work they do for the dogs they can do for you. That's right, you can put the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics to work for you there as well. And when you make that decision to make the switch to Breda Pest Management, you're going to put more money back in your pocket just for making that choice. After all, Breda Pest Management has been in business since 1975. Got 125 employees stretched out all over our marketplace. In fact, I just saw another Breda Pest Management vehicle yesterday as I was driving around because I see them all over the place because they're always out taking good care of people, and they want to take good care of you. And there's no better way to take good care of you than put more money back in your pocket. That's why you want to make the switch. So find them online. It's BredaPest.com. BREDA, BredaPest.com for more on that today. All right, so we have two very, I think, enjoyable interviews here coming up. It's going to be Mike Griffith here in just a little bit. And then later on, it's going to be Jake Fromm joining us here too. Now, let me give you a quick message about Jake here today. So when Jake joined us, he had just, this news had been reported here a little bit. I was not under the impression that necessarily was going to get necessarily a lot of attention here right now just because we're kind of the offseason time in the NFL, but there has been some reporting on this. Jake was released this week by the Washington Commanders. He had just found out about that when he was getting ready to join us. We always pre-record Jake's interview on Tuesday, at least we usually do, many days that we do. And he had every opportunity to kind of step away, not be a part of that. I mean, he literally just found out about it. And yet he still sat down, did the interview with us. I didn't ask him about that just because I actually didn't think it would probably come out and become public for a little while. And so I was just going to give him a little bit of space to not have to talk about that right in the moment it had just happened, give him a little bit of a cooling down period. But some of that has kind of come out a little bit. That Jake was released. We believe that Jake's going to be back with an NFL team here again very soon there as well. But talk about just the classiest guy in the world, his willingness to sort of sit down and be a part of this interview on the heels of having just heard some disappointing news. Jake is a really good guy, and obviously we wish him well with the next NFL team that we believe he'll land with. But some of y'all have probably seen some of that reporting, and you may wonder why we didn't ask Jake about that. It had literally just happened as Jake sat down to be with us here. So we were going to give him some space there on that, but I'm sure we'll talk about his next steps in the NFL here at some point in time again very, very soon. So just want to give you some clarification there on that. How about, though, prior to some of these great interviews, including Mike Griffith here in a moment, we go around the doghouse here. And a lot of times this show sort of ends up being a little bit of me just sort of spouting off opinions sometimes. I thought today, this came up with one of our cool downs or our first and 15 or something like that the other day. It sort of came up, we should spend some time talking about how different this season is going to be than any season that's taken place before. I think some people have a general idea of how true this is. Many of you perhaps, know more of the facts and the specifics on this than maybe even I do. But for others, we've just lived through 10 years worth of the college football playoff. At one point in time, prior to the 2014 season, that was really new. And that year, I think, was really fun as we embraced that for the very first time. This year, we're going to be embracing something else brand new for the first time. And I sort of think this is going to be kind of a fun thing, too. A lot of you know I'm a little bit of a traditionalist. I don't love all of the direction of change that college athletics is taking. I think some of it's probably Shagan Jayarajah from CBS Sports the other day was kind of thinking about sort of, okay, well, based on preseason rankings, things like that, what could this year's 12-team playoff look like? And to give you an idea of just how interesting this might be, let me show you this on the screen here. This is it's not a replica, obviously. Things are going to be very different, perhaps in real life, but it's an example of how things could look. How about Missouri playing Ole Miss in a first-round playoff game, and the winner plays Georgia in the Sugar Bowl? Like, that's really interesting. So in this scenario, Ole Miss would host Missouri. Winner of that game plays Georgia, the neutral side. He's got Oregon playing Boise State, with the winner playing Clemson there in the Peach Bowl. So perhaps a second trip to Atlanta if it will work out that way. How about a first-round matchup between Texas and Penn State? How about this in the Rose Bowl? You know, the idea that a number 2 national seed like Ohio State would be waiting to see who won a game in which Alabama would host Notre Dame in Bryant-Denny Stadium, the Fighting Irish. And then if whoever wins that game goes on to Pasadena to take on Ohio State. Y'all, this is not like the theoretical thing of what college football could be. Now, the teams may be moved around. The situation may be different. But this is the sport this year. Rose Bowl, Peach Bowl, Sugar Bowl, I guess the Orange Bowl, I believe that's right, hosting the 4, neutral site quarterfinal games with the first round, kind of taking place, prior to that. I mean, that's fascinating, right? In fact, to give you a little bit more detail on this a little bit, I'll also show you this too in terms of, okay, well, these specific locations, these specific things, like this is all really new here for this year. So the first round this year going to take place on Friday, December 20th, much earlier than it's been in the past. You'll have one game that night, and then the following day, on that particular Saturday, you're going to have 3 games. Now, the NFL is also trying to encroach on this space too because they seem to want to grab everything they can. But much earlier playoff this year, December 20th, December 21st, those are the first-round games. Then you look ahead to the quarterfinal games, kind of a more traditional time slot for that. It'll be held over December 31st and January 1st. You'll have the Fiesta Bowl. That was the other quarterfinal game. I misspoke. The Fiesta Bowl, and then you'll have the Peach Bowl, the Rose Bowl, the Sugar Bowl. Those will be the other quarterfinal games. And then the winners there will advance to another round of neutral site games. Thursday, January 9th, and Friday, January 10th, you've got the Orange Bowl and the Cotton Bowl, who have the semifinal game. So if you're a Georgia fan that likes traveling, you may be going to, let's just think about this for a moment. You could be in New Orleans, and then a few days later, now you're going to either Miami again or Dallas. Of course, the championship game is January 20th, much, much later conclusion to this year's season. January 20th, it is in Atlanta. So there's also the possibility that Georgia could perhaps be in Atlanta, obviously, to open the season, in Atlanta for the SEC championship, in Atlanta for the Peach Bowl, and then back in Atlanta again for the national championship. So you have a chance to play in Mercedes-Benz, 4 times, get more wins in that building than the Falcons will this year. You have a chance, obviously, to do that. So it is a very, very different world we're about to live in. We're going to have on-campus first-round games on December 20th and 21st, quarterfinal games with 4 neutral sites on the traditional holiday weekend. And then coming back on the 9th and 10th, having 2 semifinals also this year at neutral sites, with a championship in Atlanta on January 20th, involving some really interesting games, some phenomenal conversations. I think this is really fun. Now, there are some negative byproducts. Will, over the course of the long haul, the SEC championship matter as much as it has before? It's a fair question. It's a discussion worth having. But I feel like we've done a lot of the here's what's not so great about the future type stuff. I think this sounds to me pretty fun. It sounds pretty interesting. And I would say it's a very good year for Georgia to be right in the middle of all of that. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. So before we're done, it's Jake Fromm today, the former Georgia quarterback. A lot of good stuff to get into with Jake, including his own thoughts about the expectations that exist around a place like Georgia. But for now, more on this new playoff format. Also a little bit of a look ahead to a fun baseball series for the Georgia Bulldogs, too. Let's cover all of that ground here today with Mike Griffith on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management, time to talk to Mike Griffith here. And, Mike, we were just discussing this, that, look, I'll be totally honest with you. There's a lot of change happening for college athletics that I'm not quite so sure is change for the better, but I am pretty excited about the 12-team playoff. And I do think it makes for kind of an interesting offseason conversation that I think we're all trying to figure out, okay, what is this new version of the sport going to look like after, 10 years of what was the 4-team playoff? And, it's interesting to have the 5, 6, 7, and 8 seeds hosting playoff games. And you think about, okay, the road trip for the quarterfinals and then the semifinals and then, the championship game. You've got some interesting things getting ready to take place here around college football in the season to come, and a lot of fans trying to make sense of all of that right now. I guess, how caught up do you feel like you are on what is going to be a sport that looks a good bit different this year than what we've gotten used to over the course of the last decade?
Yeah, you're right, Brandon. It's really hard to wrap our brain around what's going to happen and how it's going to look and the ramifications of the regular season. I mean, obviously, there's still a lot to play for. You want to have one of those buys and not have to play that first playoff game. I think that's a big advantage. I think we saw that in 2017 when Alabama backed their way into the playoff without having to play in the SEC championship game. That little bit less mileage, could that have been the difference of the settling the national championship game? Perhaps. So there's still something to play for in winning the SEC. I wonder, though, do you manage things differently? And here's an example that I give. Georgia last year with Brock Bowers. Do you maybe sit Brock out a couple more games knowing that all you have to do is make the playoff versus trying to win the SEC? There was more of a margin for error, and I wonder how Kirby Smart in Georgia adjust the usage of their personnel. Attrition is a part of the game in the SEC, and Georgia's schedule is certainly challenging. Georgia Tech, if nothing else, provides a little bit more of a challenge than we expected. One of only, 5 games decided by single digits during that amazing 29-game win streak. So you wonder a little bit about how Kirby uses his personnel, and you wonder about how the playoff works out.
Yeah, let me give you a couple of examples here. We were showing this earlier. It's a graphic, and this is all just made up, but it's an example of what we'll see in real life. Like CBS Sports had, in an 8-9 game, or whatever these seeds are. I think it's 8-9. Ole Miss hosting Missouri, for instance. The winner of that game would play Georgia. You'd perhaps have Oregon playing Clemson in what would be, I guess, the second round of the playoff, if you want to call it that. An opening round game between Penn State and Texas, leading into, the idea that Notre Dame and Alabama could play in the first round. The winner of that game would go on to play Ohio State. Like that's pretty good football. It's completely different than what we have had. And, there are some, potentially negative byproducts of this. You mentioned the idea of the conference championship games. Not quite obvious what role they're going to serve in the future here. But in that 12-team playoff, that looks like some pretty good football games. And for those of us who love the college football conversation, there will be plenty of good conversation, I think, to be had around those games too.
Well, that's the idea, right, is to bring ratings and to generate more revenue, and you generate more revenue and your schools get bigger payouts and your school gets bigger payouts and you can pay players more money. And the rich get richer and the poor get poor, which bodes well for Georgia, quite frankly. So I understand the model. Brandon, if there's one thing that still bothers me a little bit, and you've heard me beat this drum as much as anyone, we've talked about it on DawgNation Daily over the years, we're still putting the college football playoffs in the hands of 13 people. There's not a clear formula. There's really not a clear device to rank these teams. And anytime you go to something that arbitrary and subjective, it leaves room for interpretation, and it may leave a little bit of room for matchup manipulation, let's say. I don't think you'll see 2 SEC teams play. I don't think you'll see many rematches. I hesitate to say that some of these rankings have been cooked a little bit for the sake of higher rankings, but I go back to the year that Notre Dame lost 34-10 to Clemson and an undefeated Cincinnati was left out. And we saw that undefeated Cincinnati team, by the way, and they gave Georgia all they wanted in a classic Peach Bowl. So I'm still a little bothered that the CFP has a committee to decide these things. I'm still a little bothered that there's not more of a set formula like there was with the PCS formula. We understood how the computer rankings and all this worked going in. We understood schedule strength. Right now, it's still a bit too arbitrary for me to feel comfortable with this. Some rankings are used, some are emphasized more than others. I'll go to my grave thinking that Georgia 2018 was a better team than Oklahoma 2018, should have got in the playoff if it was 4 best, and yet we saw politics win out. So there's a lot that I just threw out there on the plate for you, but I think the bottom line is I'm uncomfortable with the committee deciding the 12 teams and the seedings.
So I don't like the committee either. I think you and I dislike them for different reasons, but generally speaking, I don't trust the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. I don't trust them to get this stuff right. I don't think they're good at picking the playoff teams, and I've talked about that plenty over the course of the years, which for me is one of the reasons why I like the expanded playoff, because in the expanded playoff, theoretically, the committee does have a little bit less power. Now, they still have power, and they are obviously going to have, some say here. But because of the expanded playoff, more teams will be earning their way in, and the committee can't really do a whole lot to stop that. In some respects, in a 4-team playoff, that's sort of maximum power for the committee. In a 12-team playoff, there is still some committee control here, but I do believe there's less of it because some of these will be automatic bids, and some of these are just going to be inarguable points. In a 12-team playoff, an 11-1 SEC team is definitely getting in. In most cases, a 10-2 SEC team is going to get in without debate. So I do like the idea that there's just going to be somewhat less debate, and if there is debate taking place now, we're debating the difference between 12, 13, and 14, as opposed to what we do now, debating between 4, 5, and 6. We saw this past January what a mess that's going to be.
No, it sure was. And there's still a fly in the ointment, though. And Kirby Smart brought this up. He hasn't talked about it much recently because he doesn't spend much time on things that he can't control. But to me, the fly in the ointment is this. This is in the SEC championship game versus a 2-loss FSU that doesn't even play in the ACC championship. We don't know the answer for that. Does a 2-loss SEC team that does not play in the SEC championship game get in ahead of a 3-loss SEC team that plays in the SEC championship game? I didn't think Kirby came right out and said it, but I think he would want some guardrail against that you can't be penalized for playing that extra game. And that would make sense to me, Brandon. I mean, you shouldn't. It's already enough that you're going to have that extra game on your resume going into the playoff. But I don't think you should reward a team that doesn't play in the conference championship game over a team that makes it and loses because they're playing a game that the other team didn't have to play. So if we're going to continue with these conference championship games, and I guarantee you we will because they're huge money makers, they are essentially de facto playoff games. And what do you do when a team loses that 13th game and when you're trying to compare it to a team that's played 12 games? So to me, that's kind of the fly in the ointment, that SEC championship game. Can it be enough to knock a team out of the playoff and put a team in that didn't qualify for the SEC championship?
No, I think that's going to be one of those things we're watching for pretty closely. I think that's going to be interesting. Now I want to talk about some other stuff, so I want to be careful not to go too long here, but you mentioned the BCS. Let me give you my conspiracy theory going back to the BCS era. I don't believe the computers were real. I don't think there really was a computer formula for the BCS. I'll tell you why I feel that way. Because there were 3 components to it. There was coaches poll, there was AP poll, and there was computers. The human polls were 2/3 of the formula, meaning the computers were never going to be able to override the human vote anyway. So I always believe, for all the talk of, well, we got the computers for the BCS, for the most part, the computer formulas, nobody really knew what they were. They weren't going to override the human vote anyway. So my point here is whether it's the committee or whether it's AP poll voters or whatever else, all of this stuff has sort of always been whatever men want it to be, right? It's like we've never really quite graduated beyond somebody's opinion deciding who's playing for a national championship. And something about that has always felt a little bit wrong to me. But even in the days we had supposedly the computers, I'm not even quite so sure these computers really even existed.
Well, actually, I did a deep dive in that because Tennessee was relevant when it started. Now, it got a little ridiculous when they went to 7 and 8 computers and they were dropping the lowest computer formula and the highest computer formula. There was somewhat of a framework in terms of the Anderson and Hester focused highly on the schedule strength, and the Sagarin ratings were computer generated based on margin of victory and conference strength. And the New York Times computer was a bit of a mystery. I remember calling the New York Times and asking the lady that did the poll how it works. She said, I don't know. I just put the numbers in. So the New York Times computer, this was seriously, I called on a Sunday. She's like the only one in the building. I don't know how it works. I just put the numbers in. And that's because Tennessee was in the thick of the computer race that year. To your point, I do agree. It got a little heavy. I'll say this, though. The thing that Roy Kramer told me when I talked to him about this a couple of years ago, because you remember I was on a bit of a rampage after 2018. I don't think I'll ever forget Georgia being left out when they were one of the 4 best teams. And I talked to Commissioner Kramer, former Commissioner Roy Kramer, about it. And I asked him about his thoughts on the College Football Playoff Committee versus the BCS. And he told me that part of the reason why he wanted a computer formula involved is that there's an inherent bias in college sports. College sports is very regional. Roy told me that one year he served as the not the commissioner, but the executive director, I suppose, of the NCAA basketball committee when they did their back then 64-team field. He said it was the most miserable experience of his life. And you would think with 64 teams that everybody would be happy, but it really brought on more stress and more angst and more discussion because it was such a debatable thing. So in short, Kramer's theory was you need a predisposed formula to avoid the regionalism and bias that exists in the sport. And when we look at how these committee members vote, and Brandon, let's just look at who the committee members are. Again, Mike Griffith's going to remember 2018, and he's going to remember that the Georgia Tech athletic director was one of those guys, that the Florida athletic director was one of those guys, and that the Oklahoma athletic director, whose team got in over Georgia, by the way, was one of those 13 guys. To me, that's just not a fair shake. And the late Pat Dye told me, one of his final interviews, I talked to him the summer before he passed, and he said, "Are you kidding me? You better believe I would have gone against Alabama." He said, "There's no way these guys are going to be objective." And that's true. And in fact, I challenged the integrity of some of these members, Oklahoma AD specifically. And everybody said to me, Brandon, this is what they said. They shouted me down. They said, "How dare you challenge the integrity of the Oklahoma athletic director?" And do you know what happened 2 years later? Oklahoma and Texas went behind the back of the Big 12 and cut a deal. Where was that integrity there? So don't tell me that these people are completely objective and don't look out for their own interests. So look at this. We're in the middle of summer, Brandon. You've done it. You've got me all fired up about this committee and the people they put on there because I just don't think it's right.
Sure. Yeah, I'm no fan of the committee myself. Moving on. We were talking about this a little earlier. So Paul Finebaum this week was talking about feeling like the expectations at Georgia, he called them out of control, basically saying that, at this day and age, Georgia fans just sort of expect to win every game. And in this particular case, I find myself, I guess, slightly differing in my opinion from Paul Finebaum here from the standpoint of I certainly know that in college football, there is such a thing as out of control expectations. Some programs probably have it. But at a place like Georgia, I think when you see resources marshaled the way they have been, there's obviously no guarantee that Georgia wins the championship. This past year, Georgia didn't. But the thought that Georgia begins every year with it's either you did win the national championship or you don't. It's kind of a binary exercise. It's sort of one or the other because when you've done as much as Georgia's done, that's sort of the only way to measure it. And less than that, I mean, I don't want to say it's not successful. That gets to be a little too heavy-handed, but certainly Georgia is playing to win a national championship here this year. And, just being bowl eligible for a program like this is obviously nowhere near good enough that when you've done what Georgia does, there are heavier expectations that come along with that, right?
Sure. And ain't life grand? I mean, these are the good old days, Brandon. This is going to be the 8th year in a row that Georgia's the preseason top 5. Vince Dooley didn't have any top 5 teams amazingly, right? Which just tells you where this program is at and how dominant Kirby's made it. Also, the only program to finish in the top 5 7 years in a row. And yet, because of these expectations, Kirby doesn't, everybody agrees he's the best coach in the country, but he can't win coach of the year because Georgia's supposed to win. I think it's fascinating. I think it's fun. I think what's cool about it, though, is even though Georgia has these high expectations and Finebaum's certainly one to try to, raise those expectations and call Georgia out every opportunity he gets for not beating Nick Saban. That's Paul's game there. The reality of it is Kirby keeps it so, baselined here. And you don't feel like when you go to a Kirby Smart press conference that Georgia's got it solved. There's always an issue. There's always a sense of urgency. Alabama was like that under Gene Stallings in the 90s. There was always that something Coach Stallings was upset about, that wasn't good enough, that needed to be worked on. And Kirby Smart is a throwback coach. He's always going to see the glass half empty. He's always going to tell his players it can be done differently. And the fan base, I think, really understands and builds off of that. I mean, how many times have you or I or Connor Riley or Jeff, we sit around and we say, what's wrong with Georgia? What does Georgia need to do? Where is the concern at? I mean, we could spend all day talking about the 99 things out of 100 that they're better than anybody in the nation. But we're always looking for that one thing. We've been conditioned by Kirby Smart to help keep this program humble and hungry. And that's the attitude that keeps Georgia on top. There's zero sense of complacency, right? I mean, Everybody, what's the attitude of Georgia? The attitude is they didn't get it done. The attitude is Carson Beck didn't get it done and Jalen Milroe did. That's the attitude. The attitude is that, yes, they waxed Florida State 63-3, but we saw 5 games in a row, Brandon, where the other team went and scored on their opening drive. So we all know that this is a work in progress for all the talent they have and for all the confidence that we have in Kirby Smart and Carson Beck. We understand with this schedule that there's a tough row to hoe because I think Kirby Smart has done a good job of controlling the expectations where it matters. And that is in his own fan base and on his own football team. So the rest of the country looking in might just, pencil in Georgia and say it's automatic. But I think Georgia fans, and certainly you and I, understand that a lot of things have to go right, and that it's a long season. It's a process, and it's easy to slip up and lose one game. There's really not that wide of a margin for error in the SEC, especially when we reflect on last year and how the Georgia defense gave up those opening drive touchdowns in 5 straight games.
Quick final point, Georgia also getting ready to begin its final regular season baseball series of the year against Florida that comes up tomorrow, and obviously excited about that. This is a Georgia team that has clearly, it's more than just Charlie Condon now. They're a team that's perennially, I think they're in every one, and there's like 1,000 baseball top 25s, but I think they're in the top 10 of all of those. They're obviously sky high in the RPI right now. This is a team that not only has a chance to host an NCAA regional, but I would say they have a chance to make some real noise in the postseason here this summer. That opportunity at least exists for them. Mike, how much fun is this baseball team right now?
It's a lot of fun, Brandon. And if Eli Drinkowitz can be the football coach of the year for exceeding expectations, I don't know how Wes Johnson's not the baseball coach of the year. I mean, this team, I'm not going to say they were left for dead, but you had 28 new players coming in, 18 transfers and 10 freshmen. We knew Charlie was going to be back, and, as prolific as he is, the Herschel Walker of Georgia baseball, if you will, 34 home runs. He's only 6 short of the all-time record of 40, and that was before BB Corbats. I'll let you explain that later to the audience. But Charlie, that's right, there's a joke there. Charlie doing some amazing things, and Wes doing some amazing things. And I think the long and short of it, with Georgia having the number 3 RPI, which is just off the charts, BA, I think if they win 2 games, I think they're a stone cold lock to be a top 8 seed. And maybe even if they win just 1, if they've got that RPI line right now, I think they're 5th in the SEC. I don't think they can finish any worse than 6th. I think there's a shot for the Dogs to be a top 8 team. And the relevance there is now you're playing for Omaha, in my opinion, right? You're going to host a regional. We know that. There's 16, 14 regionals. We know the Dogs are going to have one here in Athens. You finish in the top 8 and you win your regional, now you're hosting a best of 3 with an opportunity to go to Omaha, which has not happened for Georgia since 2008. And there's some marketability here, right? And there's a reason to believe that Georgia might get the narrative push, because the world needs to see Charlie Condon, because the world needs to see Wes Johnson and Collins and this Georgia baseball team. It's fresh on the scene. So I expect big things. I know Florida's a great rivalry. The Gators made it tough on Kentucky. Kentucky, by the way, the number 1 team in the country. Went into Gainesville and took 2 out of 3, but it was really hard. So I expect the Gators to put up a fight. I don't think the Dogs will sweep. Probably will take 2 of 3, but at the very least 1 out of 3, and then we'll all wait and see where they're seated nationally.
Mike, fascinating stuff. Thanks for your time here today. We'll look forward to reading plenty more from you there at DawgNation.com there as well. And, of course, back here soon on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management, too.
Appreciate it, Brandon. Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, really interesting conversation with Mike Griffith there, and fun to think about what could be in store for the Georgia baseball team. By the way, speaking of that, when we talk to Jake Fromm here in a few minutes, Jake was a terrific baseball player growing up and really had original aspirations of even playing baseball at Georgia. So as you are probably not surprised to learn, he's watching Charlie Condon very closely right now in the season that Condon's having. So we'll talk to Jake about that here coming up in just a little bit. That's going to be a lot of fun. Prior to that, though, let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and let's get ready for all the fun stuff in store for Royal Caribbean here in the summer of 2024. One of the things I love is I hear from so many of you this time of year because you have your own Royal Caribbean cruise vacations planning. In fact, this is that time of year where some of you are taking that Royal Caribbean cruise up to, like, say, Alaska or something like that. But for me, I'm all about the Caribbean. I'm all about Perfect Day Coco Cay. I'm all about the fun that goes on there, that private island oasis right there in Bahamas. It's really for those exclusively on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. And the one thing I'm always so proud of is to show that off to people, because I just think it's the best that Royal Caribbean has to offer. You see right there, tallest water slide in North America if you're watching on video, the debut of Hideaway Beach, that fun adults-only enclave there. You got the Oasis Lagoon. It's the largest freshwater pool in the Bahamas. You get the thrill side, the chill side, and everything else in between. And when you're sailing on one of these Royal Caribbean cruise ships, the chance to visit Perfect Day Coco Cay, I don't think it gets any better than that. So if you've heard me talk about it, your time now to enjoy that. Our friend Jessica Slater can help you out with that. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. So A couple of things here as we go cruise around the SEC. I saw where Brett Crawford, 24/7 Sports, has done his ranking of the best facilities in all of college football. Oregon came in at number 1 on the list. Alabama came in at number 2. Georgia came in at number 3. Now, we just did a whole discussion a little earlier about why expectations at a place like Georgia are so high. They were high before Kirby Smart. All Kirby Smart has really done is sort of meet the expectations that were sort of already in place, and this is kind of part of it. Now, Kirby gets a lot of the credit for this, but, the fact that you get the talent in place, you get the facilities in place, you get the commitment from fans. Georgia has had a championship-level fan base and a championship-level donor base far before it actually had a championship-level program. Kirby has only kind of unleashed that in a way that it previously wasn't. And so think about where Georgia perhaps would have ranked on a list like this many years ago, but because the West End Zone upgrade, the House of Pain indoor practice facility, the new football building, all the stuff that's been built now puts Georgia right there near the top when it comes to the sort of facilities race in college football. The other thing I'll mention here, and I think many of you probably agree with this if you follow this closely, you sort of get the impression we've probably reached peak facilities when it comes to college football, because if you look at this list, you see, Auburn at one point in time, they're building waterfalls, and at Clemson building lazy rivers and all this crazy stuff that at one point in time people were building, and that was all the rave at the time. But now that just sort of puts them, whatever they have, kind of bottom part of the top 10, something like that, because there was always somebody else building something new, and in many cases building something better. But now, given the fact that so much of the budget may be going towards player compensation in the future, and so much of at least in the current model, so much of the donor money is being funneled towards NIL, you got to imagine that facilities are probably in college football as nice as they're ever going to get. And not to turn this into Dave Ramsey here for a moment, but you sort of imagine that in the future, when a major program wants a major facilities upgrade, they may have to take out a loan to do it, or at least go through some sort of debt service to do it, because tapping donors the way they have in the past, you sort of wonder if that's out of style now. Interesting to see what's going to happen to the facilities race in college football in the future, and whether or not there'll even be much of a facilities race. You don't hear about that in the NFL at all. In fact, some of the best NFL teams are famous for having pretty Spartan facilities. I wonder how much of college football is about to see some of that in the future. Transitioning here, so Mike Norvell, the Florida State coach, was talking. He was on the satellite radio show Dusty and Danny in the morning. He was talking about his interest in the Alabama job. I want to read the quote here, acknowledging that there was at least some, flirtation here. Norvell telling the radio program, Florida State, the job that I, get to work at, is truly it's a special place. He says you go through your career and, opportunities, conversation, whatever they might be, it's the same for assistant coaches. They go and, young men, when you're getting to pick place where you want to choose to go to school, it's always about the right fit. Norvell kind of discusses there, and you hear some of that coming in. He says, I truly believe that I have a special opportunity at a place like Florida State, and, we really poured out our heart into this program and continue to push it to get back to where I ultimately believe it deserves to be, and that's among the elite of college football. So that's what he says on the radio program about being interested in the Alabama job. But I think those of us who kind of follow this rumor mill pretty closely will say, in actuality, what may have really happened here is that while he was interested in the Alabama job, who wouldn't be? After all, Florida State's in the ACC. They are telling you themselves what a, kind of untenable situation that is. When it's all said and done, Alabama just chose a different coach. That Mike Norvell is a bit of a coach on the rise here, but I think the perception coming out of Tuscaloosa, just to be frank, is that Norvell had not had enough success with high school football recruiting to be a coach they felt like they could trust. Now, it's not like Kalen DeBoer is a great high school football recruiter anyway, at least compared to what Nick Saban once was. But, he had the extra cachet of having actually been in the playoffs, something that Norvell had to watch on TV. You may have heard something about that last winter. But the point is that Norvell seems to be speaking about potentially wanting and being interested in the Alabama job. But what he does not say, but at least seems more likely true than not to me, is that ultimately, while he was a candidate and someone that Alabama was considering turning to, ultimately they just picked a different coach. And if they would have picked Norvell, he probably would have taken that job, because Norvell, as much as anyone knows, the ACC right now is not a conference that you can win in. The ACC is not a conference you'd even want to be in if you had a choice to go somewhere else. One of the interesting stories to come out here this week is the fact that Las Vegas seems to be getting in on the college football playoff game, and it looks like they are set to host a championship game in, I believe, January of 2027, which will be the conclusion of the 2026 season. Now, for those of us who've kind of lived through a couple of years of Georgia national championships, here's the first thing. We have got to do something about these championship years. The fact that when Georgia won the national championship in 2021, all of the gear from Indianapolis said 2022, and then when Georgia won the 2022 championship in LA, it said 2023. Like, that is so confusing, and we have got to do something to fix that. So in this particular case, you see the same thing coming up again. The 2027 host site as a conclusion of the 2026 season. That's just beyond tedious, but that's the way we sort of exist here right now. But the point is, how much fun would this be? Now, people kind of get into the whole thing of, well, college sports are trying to stop gambling, and now they're going to the gambling mecca. I'm not that interested in this part of the discussion right now. All I'm here to tell you is for Georgia fans who love to travel and love to go places, seeing the dogs in Las Vegas, I believe a lot of Georgia fans would really get a big kick out of that. And I'll also mention this just very, very briefly. We've actually begun the process of voting on this year's class for the Georgia High School Football Hall of Fame. I'm very proud to be on the board there for that. We'll have our announcements about who is going to be this year's inductees coming out much later on in the summer, heading towards our ceremony that takes place every year in October. So we're looking forward to all of that. If you're interested in a couple of the Georgia names here, David Green finds his way onto the ballot for the very first time. Alec Ogletree finds his way onto the ballot for the very first time. So there are some dogs on the ballot here for the first time. And in future years, there are still a lot of very good former Georgia players, both the University of Georgia and just state of Georgia players, who haven't gotten onto the ballot yet, either because they're still active playing or because in the process of trying to populate the full class with everyone who's ever played Georgia high school football, that process just hasn't been particularly easy as of yet. Very crowded classes here thus far, but some really fun names to come up on these classes in future years, and a couple of names that Georgia fans will recognize among this year's nominees. So I'm very excited about going through the voting process on that, and this week even. It's been great to get a chance to hear from some of our historians and people who have done the research on this and kind of making their case for some names that belong as a part of this discussion. It is a really, really, cherished thing for me to be able to be a part of this, and we'll look forward to telling you more about that in the time to come. But for now, we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, time now for a Kroger Fresh Take is welcome in Jake Fromm to the program. Always great to talk to Jake about everything going on in the world of football. Jake, we appreciate your perspective. And we were talking about a topic a little earlier. I think that you probably have a little bit of an idea about this, about the expectation that exists around Georgia in a given year. And Paul Finebaum was like, oh, man, the expectations just get out of control after a while. Like, what is that like? Because obviously you come to a place like Georgia because you want to win games and you believe, obviously, Georgia has a chance to win games. And yet very quickly it becomes a situation where now you have to win every game at all times. You got to win them by a comfortable margin. You seem to handle that pretty well during your Georgia career, but what is it like with the sort of, and maybe now even more so because of a couple of national championships, what are the crazy expectations like when you're actually a player here at Georgia?
Yeah, what's up, BA? Always glad to be here with you. As you were asking your question, my mind just started rolling. I was getting a few mottos, sayings that Kirby has, pressure is a privilege.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking back to, my freshman year when, hey, the expectation to win was there. Obviously, the goal, but before you start every season is to win a national championship. But it's just a little bit different when you go 8-5 the year before, and then now it's like, oh wow, we're rolling, we can do this. There's a lot of belief and there's a lot of newness to it. And then years 2 and 3, now that expectation to win, to get over the hump is there. And kind of like you mentioned, it's not like winning. It's how are you winning? Are you winning by 20? Are you winning by 30? Did you complete 85% of your footballs? Did God forbid the offense turn the ball over? It's all these different things, and the expectation comes. You have to earn that, and it's there. And I think every single recruit and player who comes to the University of Georgia, whether through high school or by the portal, they have to understand that, and they have to buy into that, because there's a very large and passionate fan base that expects to win now and play at a high level.
So let's have an honest conversation about this for a moment, because you mentioned in 2017, okay, y'all go on to win the SEC and go on to make college football playoff, but during the season, we didn't know that was going to happen. When you beat Tennessee after Georgia had lost to them the previous year, or you beat Florida after having lost to them the previous year, do you get the sense that fans maybe were just a little bit happier back then because it all just sort of seemed newer? Georgia career, all of a sudden that's not quite so new anymore. Maybe just the mood just sort of changes a little bit.
Oh yeah. My freshman year, it's new. We were kind of like, the older guys were on their revenge tour, so to speak, in a way. And hey, we got to go back and beat all these guys who beat us the year before. Even Georgia Tech got the best of them the year before. I hate to even bring that up, but like that happened at home, and it was a big reason why Nick and Sony came back. So a lot of newness to it. Revenge tour, vibes are great. And everybody's just really just happy to be winning. It doesn't matter how it gets done, just the job has to get done. And I think that my junior year is like, hey man, if we don't win and throw for 300 yards and win by 30, then it's just a failure. And I think at times during that season it got the best of me, of just, man, I really feel like I'm enjoying football at this moment. And it's a tough space to be in, but that is the realness of it, of playing at a high level and playing there at the University of Georgia for Coach Smart.
We found out this week that the Georgia-Clemson game to kick off the season is going to take place at noon. Now, Georgia fans don't really, at least a lot of them aren't too happy about this, because they like, being downtown Atlanta, having the big tailgate, kind of leading into the big game when the game's at noon. Just not quite as easy to do that. I'm kind of curious, from the perspective of a player, I've always kind of gotten the impression the team itself doesn't mind the noon game as much, because it doesn't give you around and wait, especially in a hotel room, kind of sitting around and waiting. What is the player perspective on the earlier start? Because fans are pretty unanimous, or at least a large, overwhelming majority don't like the noon start. How do the players themselves view the early starts?
Yeah, this is just my personal opinion. In college, you could sign me up every single day. I loved that 3:30 slot.
Okay.
I just loved it, especially later in the year. You get the day game atmosphere, and then it rolls into kind of nighttime when daylight savings takes part. And it's just, you kind of get the best of both worlds. Get to sleep in. You get just enough time to check over your notes and get into the game and get into the mindset of the game. And then I also love like mixing in a couple night games as well. It just kind of brings you back to Friday Night Lights, kind of just brings you back to the good old high school memories of playing at night. And then Stanford Stadium too at night. It's just a whole different beast. Love that atmosphere. However, I will say now in the NFL, dude, I love that 1 o'clock game. I love it. Wake up, get this thing rolling, and it's just more of a business deal. It's a slightly more transactional, and you just, hey man, let me get in, let me do my work, let me go home, and let me enjoy this Sunday night with the fam, and maybe watch a little Sunday night football.
I can also imagine, as an athlete, and I'm obviously not a high level athlete, but thinking back to just sort of sports things that I've done, it's like sitting around and waiting on the thing to happen just sort of seems like kind of a pain a little bit, or one of those things where it's just sort of hard to be in the right vibe when you're just sort of sitting around all day and waiting. And I don't know. I mean, it's like different players kind of handle that better.
Yeah, let me tell you, playing in the Sugar Bowl twice, and that being a 9 o'clock Eastern kickoff time is brutal. There is nothing worse than playing in that game at that kickoff time. Like great game, great atmosphere, but man, you have to like prepare your body and go to bed at 2 o'clock and wake up at noon, for 2 days just to prepare to play in that game.
It's our Kroger Fresh Day with Jake Fromm here on DawgNation Daily. Always happy to have him as a part of the program. Happy to have Kroger here as well, and happy to have Kroger doing some big things for you when it comes to the membership opportunity known as Kroger Boost. If you want to enjoy the best that Kroger has to offer in terms of saving you money, giving you more time, then you need to become a Kroger Boost member, because the stuff that you're already buying at your local Kroger, well, you can get big savings at the fuel pump because of that, because you're going to get twice the fuel points for every dollar you spend there at your local Kroger, and you can take advantage of free grocery delivery there as well. So lots of good opportunities for you. Check it out online, Kroger.com/boost for more on that. It's Kroger.com/boost for more on that. Jake, in the time we have left, I want to talk about a completely different topic here for a moment than we would typically discuss, but I do know you love baseball. You've also been incredibly busy. You got a family and everything else going on there too. But have you gotten to see Charlie Condon for Georgia? And as somebody who kind of knows what it's like to come up both as a baseball and a football player, like, what do you make of both the success that he's having right now and the fact that, at least in some form or fashion, it kind of came in sort of an unexpected place. A couple of years prior to arriving at Georgia, Condon was not on the radar of being what he is now, but it's the kind of thing that even diehard Georgia football fans are starting to pay attention to. What have you made, if you've gotten a chance to appreciate it, of the rise of Charlie Condon as about the best slugger outside of the major leagues right now?
It is unbelievable. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he was a walk-on to start. And even if he was on scholarship, it was like a very low-level scholarship, and then now he is, a top 3, top 2, top 1 baseball player in the country. And man, it is unbelievable. Just keeping up with this guy, and if he doesn't hit a home run in a game, like something is wrong. I'll just tell you right now, this is my personal opinion, the hardest thing to do in all sports is to hit a 95-mile-an-hour baseball. It's just extremely difficult, and what he's doing right now at that level is unbelievable, man. I can't wait to see where his career takes him and do big things, in the league. And it's going to be fun to watch. But, man, I'd say if you're a Georgia fan and you love baseball, man, soak this up because this just does not come around very often.
When I was a kid, I'm older than you, of course, every coach always told us the story about how, Michael Jordan had gotten cut from his high school basketball team. That's like the sort of campfire folklore that every player had to hear from every coach about, hey, never give up, never do whatever else. Like, you got to imagine, and you know how big travel baseball is in our state, you got to imagine that, like, every kid now is going to be hearing about, it doesn't matter where you start, it doesn't matter where you are, even as a high school player, eventually you can be what Charlie Condon was, which was a little bit of a late bloomer who just sort of seemed to kind of come into his own at the exact right time, and now it looks like the rest is going to be history here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like you said, you keep working, you put your head down. It doesn't always pay off, but, man, when you keep giving yourselves opportunities to succeed and you seize on that opportunity like he's doing. And this isn't, a couple games, he didn't pitch hit and hit a grand slam at the right time. No, this dude has been doing it this entire season. And it's fun to watch, and to do that consistently on a high level, it's just even more impressive.
Jake, it's always great to have you as part of our Kroger Fresh Take. Thanks for your time here, and we'll look forward to doing that with you again very soon there as well.
Yeah, thank you, BA. Appreciate you.
And great stuff there from the former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm. Always a class act, and really, really interesting to hear his thoughts on everything happening around the Georgia Bulldogs. Let me also give a shout-out to our friends at the Finish Long Drink here. Coming up on Friday's show, we'll have some fun with our long finish, looking at some of the big things happening around the world of UGA athletics. But as you start thinking early about the upcoming weekend, make sure you're planning yourself some Finish Long Drink time there as well. Whether you're getting ready to be out by the lake or the pool or wherever you're going here, that cooler filled with ice-cold Finish Long Drink. Man, how much fun is that? It's a ready-to-drink cocktail that comes in a can. Some folks sort of think it must be a beer because they are used to seeing beer in a can. But this is not. This is a really fun category of beverage. And in this category, there's not a better tasting option than the Finish Long Drink. So I want you to go to thelongdrink.com, put in your zip code, and many of you have already tried this already, but it's time to try it again. It's time to make it a staple for you here this summer, or perhaps for many of you for the very first time. Whether it's the peach-flavored version in the peach can for a limited time, or long drink cranberry, long drink strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume, long drink zero, no carbs, no sugar, the traditional, that's the blue can, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick. Probably after all these years, probably still my favorite. I'm just sort of a traditionalist at heart, I guess. Either way, though, there's a finished long drink variety for you. So find some today online at thelongdrink.com. So as we say goodbye here today, how about a golden shoe coming the way of our buddy Georgia on Tap here? And one of my contributions to the pop cultural discussion has been my belief that Ryan Day does not have natural hair and beard color, that there's nobody his age that has a beard that's that black, nor hair either, that just sort of seems somewhat unnatural. Well, Georgia on Tap sharing a picture of Steven Seagal, who was obviously, as my formative years growing up, an action movie star. I guess he's taken a little bit of a turn for the weird in recent years. Either way, though, Georgia on Tap says apparently Steven Seagal has adopted Ryan Day's hair care regimen. I would say that you got a little bit of an unnatural look there on Mr. Seagal there as well, both goatee and hair. perhaps reminiscent of what Ryan Day has made famous. We'll give Georgia on tap some credit for that, and a golden shoe there as well. How about lousy, stinking Gators? It's been a long time since they've beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. How about 1,285 days since the lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs? That is always good news. That is our Gatorator Updater. We'll see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
And on video, time for the R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, you can test them on air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electrical. You trust them all on that. And I'm not Brandon Adams. Congratulations to everybody for realizing that. Brandon is on assignment this morning. That show that you just watched was pre-taped. He expects to join us any minute now as he's doing something at his son's school, so trying to help out and do something there. So we appreciate him for that. I am not alone this morning, which is good news. I am joined by
I think it goes back to when it comes to high expectations, a famous Kirby Smart quote is that pressure is a privilege. I know Mike Griffith said that we're living in the good old days right now, but I just don't know if that's true anymore. I think that Kirby, with the way that he's run his program, even with how fast college football is constantly changing, to have that pressure on the team, I think that's exactly what Kirby wants. And I mean, of course, the fans have always expected greatness. So I don't think that the expectation around this Georgia program has changed all that much. Oh, no, that's fine. I can keep going. Obviously, I'm working from home. I'm in my casual clothing today. But, what an honor it is to be able to host the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. I feel like Cody and I are Pippen and Rodman, and we're waiting for our MJ to come in right now. We've always joked about what it would be like to host this. So, you guys know, Brandon, the fact that he trusted us with this responsibility is a pretty big one. So I know that we're both we're both honored to be here. And with that, obviously, we're in what we consider to be like the off season, not just in football, but in terms of content for us. So we're always trying to come up with new things to talk about. So when we had that Clemson news drop yesterday about a noon kickoff, everybody was coming to the studio talking about it. And I think that we were all a little bit surprised by the noon kickoff time because, honestly, if you look at the 3:30 game, which is Miami and Florida, and then you look at the night game, which is Texas A&M and Notre Dame, it's almost like a big old insult to Clemson, right? Like Georgia, assuming would have one of those primetime slots, and now we get noon kickoff for opening weekend. It's like, it almost seems like they're taking a little stab at Clemson, that they don't think that this is going to be a big game at all. But excited to open up on neutral site, maybe have some more success in Mercedes-Benz than we've had in the past. And I know that when we found out yesterday, it just reminds us that greatness is upon us and that football season is almost here and we can all relax. I don't know if we've gotten Cody back yet, so we'll do a little check-in with him. Cody?
I don't know if you can hear me or not. We'll see. I've been trying to get this figured out. Anybody, can you hear me now? Let me know in the comments. We're still checking the comments with everybody, so we're going to check in and appreciate it. And like I said, Brandon Adams should be here any moment now. Are we all good? Can you hear me, Kaylee?
I can hear you.
Okay, that's a good sign. All right, we can hear you. Thank you, Paul Moon. Appreciate it. Good to hear. I've kind of watched all the comments, and I've been keeping an eye on the Facebook comments, Kaylee. I may suggest you don't go in the Facebook comments. A lot of talk about Connor and Kaylee, as you've come to expect from our DawgNation viewers, and they love to speculate about Connor and Kaylee. So I'll stick with the Facebook. Maybe you can keep an eye on the folks on DawgNation.com.
I'm going to have to hear about it from my grandparents later anyway.
Are they big watchers? They always tell you what's going on?
Yeah, they love. See, I try not. So, believe it or not, I try not to look at the comments too much. It's like Caitlin Clark doesn't listen to music before games. I try not to look into the comments too much. Try not to read too much into what people say. But my grandparents do love to let me know when there are comments about certain speculation.
Yeah, what I've learned is over the years that you can't. It's hard to read the comment. My years in TV news will let you know the commenters will love to say some things. I'm trying to bring in BA now, so we'll see if we can bring him in, add him to the conversation. And Brandon, welcome.
What's going on, guys? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we got you.
Thank you all for being a part of this cool down with me today on what is a little bit of a different broadcast type day for us, but I certainly appreciate that and hope everybody's doing well.
Yes, we are doing good. Are you talking to? You talking to me?
Yeah,
or talking to viewers?
In this particular case, I'm actually talking to y'all, so making sure y'all are doing okay. And obviously, we've been, kind of taking care of some business here today. Just want to make sure for a second before we bring in some comments. No, we haven't missed any kind of big news or anything like that. No shocking breaking news or anything like that right now.
No, which is rare for you not being on a show. Usually something crazy has dropped, but no, luckily with the transfer portal off and no other game times coming down, we hadn't seen much else.
What's up, buddy? Y'all want to hang around for a second? We'll take some comments together here for a moment, kind of find out what's on the mind of some of our audience. To give you an idea of why we're doing it this way today, I'm in the car here. Just finished up a really fun kind of career fair type event for some school kids. They wanted to hear more about what we do here at DawgNation, and it's really kind of funny. It's like, you have a weird job, and it's sort of hard to explain to kids what it is that you do for a living. You're trying to describe this, like, huh? What is that? But then when you say I'm a YouTuber, well, they know who Mr. Beast is. So at that point in time, that sounds kind of cool to them. So, from that standpoint, it becomes a little easier, I guess, to make sense of. But always interesting to watch kids try to process exactly what it is that we do for a living here.
Did you tell them how many cruises you get to go on? I think that would be the sell for all the kids out there. Hey,
yeah,
come be a YouTuber, and you get to check out every new ship that Royal Caribbean has to offer.
Maybe that's the case. Taylor Russell on YouTube says, show us your car. Here's one thing I can tell you. Much like the old MTV Cribs or something like that, if you came to my house, you probably wouldn't be too impressed. I live in just sort of a regular house. If you looked at my car right now, you definitely would not be too impressed by this because, I'm not exactly driving one of these super fancy cars as it is, but in the back seat down here, I can count 1, 2, 3 baseball bats, some leftover trash. I've got a bucket of balls right here. I've got a couple of props that I use for my event here in the other seat. My car is a mess. Kaylee's ridden in my car many times. She can sort of attest to that. I've got a baseball bag over here. I am not exactly living in the lap of luxury in terms of the vehicle that I drive here. Not very much, for sure. CNEOG says I borrowed Carson Beck's Lamborghini. Here's what I can promise you. If you ever see me in a Lamborghini, I can promise you that I've borrowed that from somebody because it is certainly not my own. Daniel Nelson says he always thought I'd be a pickup truck kind of guy. Like maybe one of these days I will. The truth is I don't spend very much money on cars. Now, listen, I like nice cars like anybody else does, but my kids take all my money and we, so, one of these days I might have, a big, nice pickup truck or something like that. But that day is not today because we don't spend a ton of money on cars. Paul Moon says BA's got a Cybertruck. Listen, I don't know how much a Cybertruck costs, but I'm guessing that's one of those things I probably do not have. Cody, y'all been checking out comments here thus far. What have been the messages and general themes today on the mind of some Georgia fans?
Well, a lot of love for Mike today. I think people loved that Mike was bringing the heat. He got a little agitated when he started talking about the College Football Playoff Committee and what they did or didn't do or how they might be swayed. It was fun to kind of watch everybody
So I lost Cody. I don't know if that's on my end or if that's on Cody's end, but I lost Cody. Can you still hear me? Because I cannot hear you. I don't know if that's on me or if that's on somebody else, but I'm not hearing Cody. So y'all let me know if you're still hearing.
Sorry.
I can hear you now. I certainly can.
Okay.
I can hear you now for sure.
So I was saying, and I apologize, we're new technology we don't use all the time. We got good at it for a while there when we were having to tape our shows all the time. But as I was saying, folks were loving seeing Mike bring the heat today, talking about the College Football Playoff Committee, getting all passionate about it. Who should have been swayed, who wasn't swayed, why they were trying to be neutral and they weren't. So it was fun to see Mike do that. I saw a lot of love in the comments for that. Paul Moon said,
and if you agree with me, do you agree with me, Cody, that I'm not a huge fan of the committee either, and I don't make any apologies for that, maybe for different reasons than Mike feels, but one of the reasons why I like the expanded playoff, and I told this to Mike a moment ago, one of the reasons that I like the expanded playoff is by having more teams that they're going to be selected. I do think, generally speaking, you're taking some of the power away from the committee. And even if you don't have a great distrust of the committee, I still like the idea of football things and things in sports being decided on the field. And I think, unfortunately, when you only have a 14 playoff and like 130 whatever teams as a part of Division I football, that's a lot of power in decision making, and that's a lot of beauty contest type conversation as opposed to kind of earning your way in. I do think in the new expanded 12-team playoff that we're going to have, there's just going to be more earning your way in, and that for me is a little bit of a change for college football I can kind of get behind a little bit.
Yeah, I think if you're 5 or 6 this year, you can be upset that you didn't make it in. If you're 13 or 14, this upcoming season, I think you realize, you probably should have done a little more on your resume, and maybe it is you can't, they're going to be angry and they're going to do shows about it, and we're going to talk about it, especially if, it's an SEC team that probably is better than another league's team that got in. But at the same time, you'll understand that you're 12 or 13 because you lost a game, probably 2 games at that point. Okay, well, if we'd have won those other games, then we're in. And I think that's where the 12-team playoff is going to help, because the committee, they can argue about 12 and 13, but that's really ultimately they're kind of the long shot to win the national championship anyway. So I think you're going to get all your undefeated teams in every year. So no worries about that. You got all these big-time conference champions in if you're highly ranked. So I think those are the things that are going to make this a lot easier to swallow. And they'll still be arguing, and still, stuff for us to talk about, which is a good thing. But I think 12 and 13 is a whole different conversation than 5 versus 4.
I want to read this from Johnny Prescott on Facebook. He says, also one of the subjects that have been discussed is Georgia baseball. A couple of large tailgates happening this weekend. And, Cody, I've made the suggestion here that when you look at the last time that Georgia was in a regional, I think it was 2019. I think that's right. Mm-hmm. I think the level of interest that exists around college baseball in general has gone way up since then. I think in particular, the level of interest that perhaps exists around Georgia baseball has gone way up too. I don't know that it's certainly not as big as football. It may not even be as big as, like, say, men's basketball would be if Georgia was making kind of a March Madness run. But it's bigger than it was. And I was at a game a couple of Sundays ago. I saw the way in which Georgia fans are embracing this team here right now. And obviously this has been a pleasant surprise to see them as alive in the postseason conversation as they currently are. I think when you see Georgia begin its postseason, whenever that is, I think you're going to see a lot more following by, sort of DawgNation in general around all of this than you maybe would have seen in the past. I love the way, in other words, right now, Georgia fans are embracing this Georgia soon-to-be postseason run.
Yeah, I would agree. I would think as a regular season baseball team, this team's getting so much more buzz around DawgNation than we've seen in a long time. But 18 to 19, Georgia hosted regionals and kind of laid an egg in both of them. And, Mike Martin's final year against FSU in the 1, so that was different. But I will tell you, the buzz, when you go back to 08 and 06 being at Foley Field, those teams that did make it to the College World Series, those teams, there was the crowds were crazy then too, and they're all hanging out at the greenhouse out in the back, and they're tailgating out in left field. So I think there are Georgia baseball fans, but I think that didn't really happen, I don't think, until postseason. I think this team during the regular season with what Charlie Kahn is doing is getting a lot more buzz than maybe they do during the season.
Yeah, what I would kind of compare this to is, like, when you go back to, like you said, Kudzu Hill days, things like that, and what obviously, was happening back then with Gordon Beckham and some of the stuff like that. It's almost like the cool band that when you're in college that you knew about. I think that college baseball was really fun back then. I remember being in a super regional around that time when Georgia went to Tech and won. And that was really cool. And I think it was really fun for those who were there. But one of the things I think the SEC network has been really good at, by putting more of this stuff out on video, even if sometimes it's streaming and sometimes it's like, it feels like sort of one camera stationary the entire time, it's still accessible. And I do think the SEC network, and I believe they deserve credit for this, the SEC network has given way more access to baseball and softball and gymnastics, especially like the Friday night stuff that they do, that I just think that I think it's easier to be a fan that follows other sports now because you've got at least some video coverage of that. And, there've always been fans of the other non-football sports, but now I think it's a little bit easier for the average fan or the casual fan to get involved because there is just more coverage than there used to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was talking about, that 06, 08 team, the Georgia Gymnastics at that time was doing so well. And at that time, I was working at GeorgiaDogs.com, and we were streaming a lot of that stuff. Even softball, I called Georgia softball for a couple years, but I was doing it just kind of as a radio broadcast. Now, pretty much all, you can see so many more games on TV, or at least you know where to find it streaming. And I think streaming pretty much every college baseball game, you can find it out there. I think that is, like you said, that's a huge part of it. I would love to see Georgia, you think about Georgia Gymnastics in that time, winning 5 in a row under Suzanne Youngkin. If we can get back to that when college gymnastics is so high right now, and hopefully the new folks coming in there, we're talking a lot of Olympic sports right now, but hopefully the new coaches there can get that program back to kind of that prominence, because college gymnastics and all these other Olympic sports, like we said, are on a different platform than they've ever been.
So checking in over at DawgNation.com here for a moment. Baruch Dog talking about his time working for ESPN, kind of an interesting background there for that. We also talked about facilities in the show a little earlier. Baruch mentioning the fact that he thinks that Oregon has nice facilities, but their stadium is nowhere near as good as Samford. Alabama is on par with UGA, not better, not worse. I've been to almost all of them. I think one of the cool things about Samford Stadium in recent years, this doesn't get a lot of attention because people notice other stuff more, is they've widened the ticketing area a little bit more. On the north side of the stadium, they've extended the ticketed area kind of into the sort of campus academic part a little bit, made it a little bit easier to get around. There's obviously a decent size expansion now on the south side. And, people will see the new press box and they'll see some of the new luxury seating. But I think that one of the things that's made Samford Stadium a better game day experience last couple of years is they've widened the ticketed area, made it a little bit easier to get around. Even though people don't like the bridge being closed, I understand why they don't like that being closed. I do think that it's made it a little bit easier to traverse that area. They've also increased some of the signage in there too, which makes it look more like a Georgia home stadium. I think little things make a big difference. I would say in the last couple of years, for the average fan, Samford Stadium's become a much better game day experience. Now, to be honest, I think there are some areas when there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think there's some concession improvements that could be taking place. Obviously, this year they're going to do beer for the first time. I'll be interested to see how that goes, just from a convenience and a point of sale standpoint. But I do believe the game day experience for the average fan has certainly gotten better over the years because, Cody, people don't realize how old a lot of these college stadiums are. Georgia's dates back to the late 1920s. And I don't know, I guess people were just a lot smaller back then because getting around the stadium has never been an easy thing when I was growing up, but it's much easier to get around. The stadium looks nicer in the kind of concourse areas because there's a lot more Georgia-themed stuff going on. I think it's just an overall much better experience.
Yeah, I think they've put a lot into it too because of the TV, right? So it becomes so comfortable to sit at home and watch a game that they've got to make that experience better. And I think Josh Brooks and even before here, Greg McGarity realized that and started doing some of those things, whether it's just, simply just bathrooms and stuff like that they've got to get right. And the stuff they did, this past season, made a huge difference on that side. Because, sounds terrible, but I'm in Sanford Stadium a lot. I'm not usually walking around, up where the fans are a lot. So I don't have a ton of experience, whether it's just maybe going from the press box down to the field, but widening it out, just feeling it a little bit brighter. It's a much better feeling, especially when it's hot and you get people crammed in there all together. It can be just a miserable experience. And I think they've realized, just pushing the boundaries of the ticketed areas, like you said, out a little bit, just kind of makes you be able to breathe a little bit with 93,000.
Also, DT agreeing with something I said earlier in the show, which is that back during the BCS era, I don't think the BCS computers were real. I just don't. Like, when it's only a third of the formula, essentially the human polls are always going to outweigh it anyway. I think the computers were a way to make the process sound fancier than it really is. It's the same thing now where, supposedly we have all of this data available to the committee. They're not using that stuff. They're just picking whoever they want to, which is essentially what the pollsters were doing back during the BCS era. So as far as I'm concerned, all of this stuff has sort of always been whatever people wanted it to be. And, whether it be AP poll voters or coaches poll voters, or you want to go back to the old days, UPI poll voters, in a roundabout way, I'm not really quite so sure the system now is all that much different than it used to be, other than the fact that it's just a smaller number of people who get the power to make the ultimate decision.
I always like to think like the computers are like the ones, with the spinning reels, those old school computers. You gotta have a punch ticket to put in there because, it just didn't seem like, I know Mike said he did a deep dive, and I'm sure there probably were some computer programs, but I do agree that, a lot of the voters, and they get together in Dallas or wherever they do it, and they do talk about it. But I think there's so much data out there that a lot of times they're going to keep an eye on ESPN and see who everybody's talking about and who are the people they feel like they're told they kind of need to be in there.
I want to finish with this topic here. Paul Moon brings this up, and I completely agree with this, although I don't think everybody does. He says that he thinks it's really funny that people are nostalgic for the BCS there. He says that's hilarious. Everyone hated the BCS at the time. And I think it's really important because there's a lot of stuff going on in college sports right now that a lot of us don't always love. And so therefore, when there are things that we like or think are better than they used to be, I think it's important to kind of point that out, Cody. And for me, this is one of those things. There's a lot about the selection process of the college football playoff that I might rail on, but ultimately I like the playoff. I think the playoff is an improvement over the BCS. It's certainly an improvement over the system that was in place when I was a kid. And I think the 12-team playoff is an improvement over the 14 playoff. The graphic we showed earlier of what the potential matchups could look like. Cody, that's good football. Now, you can say what you want to about a lot of different things, but nobody's going to, to use double negative, nobody's going to not want to watch that. That's good football. So I would say in general, as a fan, I am pro college football playoff. And for this upcoming year, I'm also pro expanded college football playoff as well.
Yeah, and I think kind of what Mike said, I do think, the 1 through 12, the numbers are going to get moved around, right? So you don't get a rematch or, some of these cold weather teams, is that going to make a difference if they're hosting? But yeah, the thought that this is going to go all the way through to MLK Day in Atlanta for the first championship. Yeah. And you talked a little bit about the strategy, right? So does Ladd McConkey need to play in the SEC championship? If we know we're going to be in the playoff, win or lose in the SEC championship game, there's different things to talk about. It's great for us because, there's a little more strategy to it. And you talk about the NFLification of college football. Well, week 17, we see how many people, or week 18 now, how many teams are just sitting their starters because they know they're in the playoff already. And, could we see some of that? That will be interesting as well. But, hopefully it keeps a lot of these holdouts or the folks that are skipping the bowl games from doing that. You just look at some of those matchups that we showed on the screen earlier in the show. Like, how can you not be excited about the potential of, some of these games that are going to be built up and then on college campuses where it's going to be crazy, even if it is during winter break?
Now, flip side of that is I do think, because I would say that pound for pound, my single favorite sporting event over the course of the last, certainly the 21st century, has been the SEC championship. I just think it's almost always a sure thing. Now, Georgia hasn't always won, which obviously as a fan disappoints me, but the overall game itself is just such a well-done thing. I just love it. I've been there even in years in which Georgia wasn't playing. I just think the SEC championship is a really good sporting event, and it has always meant far more than the other conference championship games do. So I do think it's a fair question. I thought that Mike brought up an interesting point about this a little earlier about teams that could play their way out of the playoff because of the championship game. I do think at some point we have to have a serious conversation about what the role of the SEC championship is going to be going forward. It's not obvious to me right now what that is, but that doesn't change my excitement about the 12-team playoff. It doesn't. I don't want the SEC championship to become what, like, say, conference basketball tournaments have become, because I would say for the most part, other than like an NC State this year, those are mostly meaningless now. The committee, for the most part, doesn't even watch them because we don't see anyone's seeding change because of what happens during those conference tournaments. I don't want the SEC championship to be equally as irrelevant. It's not obvious to me how it's going to find its relevance moving forward, but I'm still excited about the 12-team playoff, even if I do think at some point we have to re-examine what the role of the SEC championship is supposed to be.
And I think we're so excited about the playoff. But one thing the playoffs have taught us over the last few years, they're going to be blowouts. And they're going to be blowouts, especially when teams get a home field advantage and you get one of these small conference teams going on the road to Bryant-Denny, or say they come to Sanford Stadium. Yeah, we're still going to see more blowouts, but it'll be more football. It'll be spread out over a longer period of time. And yeah, I totally agree. Kirby Smart was asked about the SEC championship. I mean, he's always said it means so much to him. It's just as hard to win an SEC championship as a national championship. That's always his line. And I think it will still be important to him. But when you have a player, and Georgia was in that situation, Amarius Mims coming out, is him coming out of that game a good thing at this point? If Georgia knows, all right, we got to play, and we got to play soon if we don't win this SEC championship game, because we're going to turn around and not get the bye. So I think there's going to be a lot more kind of decisions like that. But I do think, Georgia is not going to go out there and not try and win the SEC championship game.
All right, fun conversation. Cody, thanks for helping us out with this here today. And for those who are just joining us, had some business to take care of today. Had a chance to talk to some school kids today, a very fun experience. So we're doing the cool down today a little bit different than we normally do. Tomorrow, though, everything back to normal, live as we always are, and looking forward to all of that. So let me say a big thanks to our friends at RS Andrews who make all of this possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs, showing up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. That means that if your water heater goes out, you don't want to take cold showers, and you certainly don't want your family taking cold showers, because goodness knows they're going to let you hear about it if that's the case. So go ahead and get that water heater, in many cases, replaced the same day. That's what RS Andrews is all about. So find them online at rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day. Thanks for being here as part of our RS Andrews Cool Down. And, of course, prior to that, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to back in studio, seeing you live back here tomorrow.